Welcome to everyone. I'm thrilled to have this first Birds of a Feather session. We've got a fantastic lineup, and we're very much looking forward to your engagement and interactions. This is my name's Julia Lane, and I'll be kind of kicking this off. I'm going to put the agenda up shortly. This is a standard webinar. The panelists will be speaking, and we've got time for discussion. If you would put your questions in the chat as you're going through, I will read the questions and ask the presenters to respond. So as many questions as you possibly can, please make those available. So let me kick off with this Birds of a Feather session. This is the background to this is, as many of you are aware, we had a real interest in building a class on data literacy and evidence building. It was joint with University of Maryland, it's NYU, Accenture, Kentucky Stats, and the College Initiative. And the subjects of the class are in the header up here, so you can see what we did every week. And we had a distinguished advisory board, and the advisory board said, this all looks great, but a lot of the learning is taking place in teams, and the teams are kind of isolated in the sense that they don't get a chance to talk to each other, so they don't get a chance to talk across states. So they suggested that we do a Birds of the Feather sessions. We asked the people in the class, who mainly represented state education workforce agencies, what topics they were interested in, and they identified 2 topics. So the first one is what we're going to be talking about today is job quality, and the second one is missing data. So this is the first session, January 23rd, 12 to 2, and then next week, January 30th, is the second Birds of a Feather session, which is on missing data, that is going to be run by Dr. Frauke Kreuter. The core idea here is lots of people come up with lots of useful ideas. Part of what we were trying to do in the class is not just teach the basics of these areas focused on using real world data, but it's also to develop networks. So one of the things we're very much hoping is that after this Birds of a Feather, people will take these ideas, work with the multi-state collaboratives, work with the College Initiative, work with their state agencies to start developing these networks and new ideas. The reason I think the focus on quality jobs has really hit agencies in both education and workforce agencies is the importance of legislation. These are some of the biggest spends that we've seen in the past 30 or 40 years on creating high-wage, high-quality jobs. The CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, and federal agencies are starting to reach out to workforce and education agencies to help them figure out, how do we actually measure these high quality jobs? You're going to be hearing about one of those efforts today from Dr. Weinberg, talking about the NSF Industries of Ideas project. So here's the agenda. It's also in the chat. But just to give you a sense, as I said, I'm Julia Lane. I'm giving the overview right now, and I'm going to shut up at 12:10. Harry Holzer, who is a distinguished labor economist and a co-author, I'm proud to say, who's been involved, I think, probably more than anyone else in the country in thinking about how to define good jobs, particularly focusing on low-wage workers, but across the board as well. He has been working with both the Brookings Institute as well as the American Enterprise Institute. He's from Georgetown, but he's also been working with a bunch of universities, including Harvard, on a workforce quality initiative. And so he's going to talk a little bit about the work that's been done with state data and with LEHD data in particular. We're then going to hear from Dr. Weinberg from Ohio State, which is a very practical approach to thinking about how do you use UI wage records and QCW records to focus in on the firm-based jobs measures. And this is part of a pilot project with the National Science Foundation with looking at the impact of their regional innovation engines. Angie Tombari from University of Kentucky has been with Matt Berry and before that with Jessica Cunningham from Kentucky Stats. They've been looking at job quality from the focus of education outcomes. That has expanded from a single bilateral state discussion between Kentucky and Ohio that actually came out of one of these classes to now a 7-state, and I think more states are joining. So she's going to talk about a very practical example as well. Dana Brandt is from Rhode Island State Longitudinal Systems, and she's going to talk about some of the approaches that have been used with the SLSs. As you know, there's been a massive federal investment over the past 10 years in building state longitudinal systems. So she's going to give some perspective on what they've been doing in Rhode Island. I'm going to talk a little bit about the job quality measures that the states have done that have come out of the class. So there were 10 states represented in the class. And the point from this is, from that class, working with linked education workforce data that were synthesized, but still learning how to work with the data, they came up with lots of job quality measures that were richer in many ways than the simple workforce WIOA measures. And we can learn a lot from their ideas and also recognize that some of the measures that they've developed could readily scale using just the network approach that this kind of birds of a feather session are going to introduce. And then Yvette Chocolat from NASWA and Jess Cunningham from the College Initiative are going to talk about what the state collaboratives are doing and how the infrastructure, the organizational infrastructure that's being built with NASWA and the College Initiative could help move this to the next phase, because we're kind of at the core of getting this jump started. So I'm going to stop the outline here. Just a reminder to all of you, if you've got questions, put them in the chat. I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Holzer, and we're going to hear about his approach to measuring good jobs. So Dr. Holzer, I have to be very polite to him because otherwise he gets very angry. So that's a joke, yes.
Thank you, Julia, for that interesting introduction. So I'm going to talk about some past work that I did with Julia and our friend Frederick Anderson. We were interested in job quality and how that pertains to a number of important issues, like how do low-wage workers advance out of poverty, or exactly where are we finding good quality jobs and who are getting those jobs. So we started working together in the year 2000, quite a while ago, and we worked together for about a decade, and we generated the 2 books you see there, Moving Up or Moving On, Who Advances in the Low-Wage Labor Market in 2005, and also Where Have All the Good Jobs Gone in 2011. Both of those were published by the Russell Sage Foundation. And what we did in all of that work is we used unemployment insurance wage records, quarterly wage records from the UI system, linked to some QCEW data, quarterly census unemployment and wages, to analyze these job quality issues. And as I've mentioned, the 2 issues listed there of the importance of job quality and escaping poverty and trends in job quality. Now, the key feature of these data, and the reason we focused on these data in trying to get measures of job quality was that these quarterly wage records are longitudinal, both in workers and in firms. So if you have 5-10 years worth of data, you can watch all of the workers in a state who are part of the UI work system. You can follow them across different jobs, and then you can look at all these different firms and the different workers that they match to. And I just want to take a couple minutes to explain why that characteristic of the data is so important in this effort. A lot of efforts to define job quality. And sometimes people try to use the different survey data that are out there. Probably the best well-known was the Current Population Survey or the American Community Survey. But I want to say why those surveys don't work, whereas these quarterly wage records do work. The problem with the usual survey is you have these measures of workers' earnings. You can control for a limited set of demographic characteristics, race and gender, age and education. You have a few characteristics of the job, like occupation and industry. And people might be tempted to say, okay, take a person's earnings, control for those few variables that we have, and call the rest of it the quality of the job. That doesn't work, because very simply, you can never control for all the characteristics of workers that you need to control for to really isolate the effects of their job rather than the effects of their own qualities. You can never control for all of their abilities. You can never control for all of their motivation and other personality characteristics. So you never really know, is it really the job, or is it these unmeasured characteristics of the workers filling those jobs that you can never really control for? So the survey stuff almost always leads you to a dead end. The reason that we could use these quarterly wage records where you can follow workers over many years and you can follow firms and their jobs over many years is that you can calculate something called a worker effect and a firm effect when you do that. When you watch the same worker moving in and out of a whole range of jobs, you can estimate a component of their earnings that seems to move with them no matter what job they have. On average, it's the component linked to that person. We call that a worker effect. And we believe that worker effect captures all the stuff that you can't usually control for in survey data. And then once you can control for those worker effects, you can control for firms, firm effects, and the average component that each firm adds to all these different workers. And that firm effect is what we really consider a measure of job quality. You're controlling for the workers, and you're looking at the effects of these firms as different workers move in and out. When the firm effect is above average, we consider that a good job. When the firm effect is below average, we consider it a bad job or not as good a job. And that's the key measure, controlling for the characteristics of the worker. Excuse me for a second. I can't do that now. Please close the door. I can't. No, I don't know. I don't need it. Sorry about that. I'm actually ensconced at a hotel room today trying to do this. Anyhow, that is our measure of firm effects, job quality. If you turn to the next slide, I can tell you how those measures of firm effects matched to different kinds of workers answered some of the questions we were interested in before. In the book, Moving Up or Moving On, we started with a sample of low-wage workers who seemed to be stuck at low earnings when they had already become adults, prime age adults, who didn't seem to be moving up. And then we started following them over a 9-year period to see what happens when they get different kinds of jobs. And it turned out for those really low earners, the key characteristic to move them out of poverty level wages was actually moving to a higher quality job at a firm that pays better wages, which has enormous implications for anti-poverty policy, right? You got to train workers and link them to these good jobs wherever possible, and that will help them move up. In the second book, Where Are All the Good Jobs Going? Early on in the period, we were looking again over a 9-year period. Early on, you saw a lot of these good jobs, a lot of these positive firm effects in manufacturing and in other industries, hiring a lot of blue-collar workers. By the end of the period, that was somewhat less true. And increasingly, to get a good job, you had to be a more highly skilled worker. In other words, early on, a lot of the good jobs were places like GM, where everyone from the CEO down to the security guard benefits from the firm wages, from GM's high wages. And towards the end, it was more like Microsoft, where only highly skilled professionals were being matched to these good jobs. And other studies since then have borne that out. So this has important policy implications, but again, the key feature is this ability to follow both workers and firms over time. Now, are the data perfect? Of course not, right? You only have dollar earnings, you don't have the value of benefits. Often you don't have hours worked, so you don't really know are these people have high quarterly earnings because they're working a lot or because they really have high wages. You often can't look by occupation. There's things missing. Nevertheless, this remains the single best way we have to measure the quality of a job while really controlling for the worker and his or her tendency to have high wages or not. And every state has these data. So really, these kinds of studies can be done in any state right now. So why don't I stop there and open it up to see if there's any questions or comments about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. That was fantastic. I'd like to encourage people to put questions in the chat. And before we get started, I see we have one, but the policy implication that you're talking about is that the value of the understanding the matching is that the focus, which has always been on, should we train more workers, you can get as far or even further by getting better matches between firms and workers. And that placement process is the policy of interest. So let me read you the two questions. These are great questions. How do you model changes in technology on worker outcomes using this data? And I think actually Bruce Weinberg is going to talk about that in just a minute. But then that was from Josh Hawley. And then from Lance Foss, wouldn't this be better labeled quality wages, good wages, moving wages beyond measured poverty versus quality employment? Wages are a component of quality employment, yes?
So I guess I can take a quick stab at those questions. Yes, wages are, starting with the second question first, wages are the measure of quality that we're looking at. But the key idea is to isolate the firm component in that wage as opposed to the worker component. And as Julia said, how those firm and worker components are being matched in the labor market when these firms hire these workers. You're right that wages are the ultimate measure, but again, the key measure of the job and the job quality is in fact that firm effect, which we can isolate from looking at all those different wages of all those different people in different firms. So I think that's why we call that the firm effect, the quality of the job as measured by people's wages. Now, the second question, how do you model changes in technology? Well, that's very challenging, and it's challenging no matter what kind of data you have. I think when you see the component of the firm perhaps changing over time, if you have a long enough period, you can estimate separate time periods. Like so if you have 10 years, you could look separately at each 5-year period and then see if the firm component is growing or falling over time. That's not a completely clean measure of technology. But if that firm is raising its component and also seems to be matching their jobs to more highly skilled workers than they were early on, that's a really good sign that their technology has changed. And what you're seeing is really what economists call skill bias technical change, where you really need high quality workers matched to high quality jobs. But I think that would be our best effort at getting changing technology and its impact on job quality.
Well, we've got a whole bunch of great questions and only a few minutes to follow them, but each one of these is great. Paul Tattery wanted to have a very brief summary on what precisely is the firm effect. So maybe a couple of sentences on this. And a related question is Ross Evans, which is if the underlying metric for job quality is wages, how is this measured? Arithmetic mean, median, or what? And then we've got a couple of other questions from Adam Leonard and Josh. Go ahead.
I think the first question was really clearly define the firm effect. So the technical term in a statistics class would be the firm fixed effect. And it's if you're running a regression, and forgive the technicality, you're running a regression on all these different workers matched to all these different firms. There's a dummy variable for each firm over time, and that gets a coefficient. When that coefficient is above 0, it means on average for workers of different quality, that's a good firm paying good wages and good jobs. If it's below 0, it's not a good firm. It's sort of below market. And it's that coefficient on that firm effect that we define as the quality of the job over time rather than the quality of the worker.
So another way of saying that for Paul is what that is the observationally equivalent workers who are paired with different firms. What is the premium associated with firm X versus firm Y? And that's why the matching of firms to workers, you've got a premium associated with education. You've also got a premium associated with the firm. So that's the summary. Sorry, Harry.
No, that's good. Yep. That's good. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
How is that measured? Arithmetic mean, median, or what? And I think you should just summarize that.
Well, regressions are almost by definition measured at the mean for different workers and for different, and you can't use medians unless you use a whole different technique of quartile regressions. But if you're worried about things like outliers, you could simply strip them out of your sample, and that would give you a cleaner measure. But it is the mean effect that regressions are capturing.
And Lance came back with a follow-up. It could be for workers working in dangerous conditions, and you could like mines or yeah.
That's true. That's true. I mean, economists have a theory of the labor market called compensating differentials, where if you have a high wage, it's compensating for some aspect of the job that you may not like. And you're right, with these kinds of data, you can't necessarily strip that out of the worker effect. But on the other hand, if you look at the industry in which these effects are occurring, in professional services, it's not going to be dangerous jobs or things like that. So it's a theoretical concern, but I think descriptively, when you look at the data, you can figure that kind of thing out.
And so feeding back to your comment before about how do you capture technological change, if you see a change in that firm effect because the technology, to the extent that technological change increases earnings, you would see that embodied in the firm effect. So that's why you answered the question the way you did.
Right.
We've got a closing question. We've got a note from Josh Hawley that it excludes 1099 workers. We'll be probably talking about that in the missing data birds of a feather next week. But Adam had a question: to what do you attribute the change in findings between the first book and the second?
Well, for one thing, we were looking at a slightly later period. This issue of better workers increasingly getting matched to better jobs, that didn't seem to affect our findings very much in the 90s. And in the first book, we were looking at these low wage workers in the 90s. By the second book, we're further into the 2000s. And I think this increasingly matching, and this is just a huge issue, because if it's only highly skilled workers that are not only, but on average, so both those things could be true at the same time, by the way, right? You could say that increasingly higher skilled workers are being matched to higher wage jobs, still means that there's some room for less skilled workers to be matched those jobs. But it means that maybe those workers are swimming against the tide a little bit, and it's harder to match them. But so the two aren't necessarily in contradiction of each other. But I think that trend, as we got into the 2000s, it was becoming harder for low wage, low skill workers to do, but certainly not impossible. It's not impossible today.
So What a fantastic overview in a very short period of time with lots of complex issues. And just to remind everyone, the bottom line here is, you know, to some extent that job match, when Harry said that was important policy implications, that job match as a policy focus is the core of what you can do with these wage records that all the states have, as you said, and the QCW data. So yes, it would be nice to have benefits and pensions and so on, but you get an awful lot of bang from the buck from this very important data source.
Absolutely.
So, fantastic. Thank you so much, Harry. You're
Thank you,
worth
Julia. Thanks,
every
everybody.
penny that I don't pay you. Bruce, let me turn it over to you. And Dr. Weinberg is a professor at Ohio State University, and he's going to be talking about joint work with the National Science Foundation. So, Bruce, take it away.
Great, thanks, Julia. I'm glad that this is being recorded, so I can hear you referring to me as Dr. Weinberg. I'll remember that for posterity.
I have to be polite sometimes in public.
Exactly. And my screen is showing, correct? Okay, great. So I'm excited, thrilled to be here, and excited to be able to talk to you about this new project that's been funded by the National Science Foundation's TIP Directorate. It's the title is in terms of industries of ideas, and it's about building a system for measuring the effects of investment in new technologies on firms and on workers. It's joint with Anna Harvey from the Social Science Research Council and NYU, and Jason Owen Smith from the University of Michigan, and Josh Hawley, who's I saw in the chat, is also deeply involved in this work as well. So, so the starting point for this project was that NSF, as part of the CHIPS and Science Act, is required to report on the returns on investments in 10 critical technologies. And, we felt that we had some ability to use the kinds of data and methods that we're talking about here that Harry teed up so beautifully to try to quantify the effects of those investments, and especially at the moment, more of a footprint type analysis than sort of a causal type analysis, but hopefully in future steps, a causal research design as well. We're focusing on two critical technologies, artificial intelligence and electric vehicles. But we're using a technology agnostic approach. The key to this approach is to follow the people. So it's a person-based approach, and it's a community-driven approach, because we think that we have a whole number of partners, and it's critical that they all see value from participating in this, providing data, providing input in terms of the questions that folks want to have, and helping us vet and validate and disseminate the results as well. A top-down approach isn't going to be successful. I think the other key here is the technology agnostic approach, and I think that's critical also, because it will be reduced costs to use one approach across a whole range of technologies, but it will also has the advantage of making the estimates for different technologies comparable to each other, is rather than having a measure of how investments in AI affect one thing and how investments in electric vehicles affect another thing. We can say, look, these are the types of returns that have been experienced from all of these technologies using a common benchmark. And that's sort of the part of the person-based logic, because by tracking people, we have the ability to have a common measure of how investments in technologies are operating. And the key here is what we're doing is we're using U-metrics, which many of you will be familiar with. It's looking at people who are employed on sponsored research projects. We can identify what the substance of those research projects are. So are you working on AI? Are you working on EV? Are you working on something else? And then not just the principal investigators, but all of the people, all of the graduate students, all of the staff, all of the postdocs who are working on, and undergraduates who are working on those projects, and then trace them through UI wage data to see where they're getting their jobs, and then look at those employers, those firms, and how they're performing, as well as the other workers at those firms. So we're starting with UI wage data using from the state of Ohio, and Josh has been, really critical in doing that. And our goal is to demonstrate the potential of this approach and then to scale to other technologies, other states, and even other analyses. So let me talk to you a little bit about sort of the specifics of what we're doing. We're measuring, as I say, we're identifying people who are employed conducting research on AI and EV. We are identifying them in the Ohio UI wage data, and then we're seeing when they get a job at a firm, and then we're looking at that firm as well as the other workers there. So we're looking at things like employment and hires and turnover/churn. And we have a variety of measures looking at growth and totals and full year employment and so forth. We can also look at things like earnings and payroll, total earnings, the average earnings, the different percentiles of the earnings distribution. I mean, this sort of, I think, dovetails very nicely with some of the things that Harry was talking about before, in terms of sort of the stretching out of distributions. And we can also look at the specific industries, the specific sectors that people are that these businesses are in, that people are working in. So the key here is, as I say, is that our goal is to scale the work that we're doing. So, across, other technologies, across other states as well. And so what we've been doing is we've been developing code that can be applied broadly, so that this can be implemented at relatively low cost in other states. That'll, also increase comparability. I have no reason to believe that, I should say Ohio is exceptional, but in this particular way, I have no reason to believe that Ohio will be exceptional. But we can make comparisons across states, and provide code to people to do this. And we also have the potential of informing workers in terms of where the jobs are. And I think ultimately we'd love to see this, not part of the current project, but ultimately I think we'd love to be able to look at, what types of workers are being hired, what training they have, since if you looking at transcript type data, and seeing, what kind of degrees they have, the people who are being hired by AI, EV, other firms. So we're really excited about the project, and I'll look forward to working with other people and getting some questions.
Thanks for that, Bruce. So effectively what you're doing is you're taking, and please put questions in the chat. So effectively what you're doing here is you're taking information about all of the investments that are being made in, like, chips and science and the Inflation Reduction Act and so on. And then you're looking at the individuals who are working in universities, and you're tracing the way in which the ideas flow into firms, and then trying to characterize their hiring strategies. I was at a supercomputer conference in November, and I was told that PhDs in computer science coming out of Stanford were making $750,000 a year plus options. Now, clearly, the firms that were hiring them in order for those ideas to be transmitted to the firms. So effectively, what Harry was talking about was the good firms, and what you're talking about is, to some extent, the investments in research are going to be able to be transmitted to create technological change in the firms and create more good jobs. So instead of thinking about technological change as being something firms just do, firms do it because of the research investments and the kind of research investments that are happening in the future. Is that a way of characterizing what you're discussing?
No, I think it's actually a great way of thinking about it, and I think it's also particularly useful for thinking. So if you start with that question, sort of what is the impact? What are the impacts of the technologies? In some cases, you could go out and say, well, I'm going to look at patents and see what firms have, large patent portfolios in particular technologies. But for something like AI, you know, our sense is that a lot of the businesses that are using AI are not patenting in AI, right? These are not firms that are tech firms that are developing AI algorithms. These are banks and insurance companies and hospitals that are using AI to solve practical problems that they have. And so rather than trying to say, here are the markers of IP or investments in these things, let's look at which firms, which businesses are hiring people who have these kinds of skills, and then say, well, let's look at the outcomes of those businesses.
Yes. So we've got a bunch of really good questions. So just to summarize, technological change is occurring because both the feds and the states are making big investments in technology. They're doing it in the research, and the way in which the technological change occurs is because you've traced the people, and the wage records enable you to do that. So I think that's a really important point, and you can look at the quality of jobs. A set of questions. How is this from Josh again? What's the model for other states to look at the impact of investments like AI and EV? There's a question about, can you look at differences by race, ethnicity, gender? And then there's another question about the privacy issues.
Great. No, so these are all really key questions. I think in terms of scaling, I mean, the goal is to work with other state agencies through the regional collaboratives, try to see what types of questions people have. Hopefully the questions that we're answering are questions that are going to be of relevance to a lot of different states and universities. So but to try to understand what types of questions people need to get answered, want to get answered, how, what kind of these workforce impacts are, and to share code, make it available to people. I think the question in terms of demographics is a great one. Those are, not all of these demographic, not all of these demographic characteristics are available in the UI wage records, right? So we're able to see things like gender and age, but unfortunately in those data, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, we're not getting things like race and ethnicity, although those would be tremendously.
Although you've got some of that from the education records.
Yeah.
What kind of privacy issues? So demographics, not so much on the wage records, but certainly from the links to the education data that Josh and others have pioneered. So this linked, all the investments in the state longitudinal data systems start to pay big dividends at this point. Privacy questions, how are we going to address those?
Yeah, no, that's a serious concern. So I think part of what we're trying to do.
And Adam jumped in and made exactly that point. So thanks, Adam. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, that's right. For people who are university trained, we can go through and get demographics from the educational records for sure. So in terms of the privacy issues, I think part of what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to look at the firms that are hiring people with this research experience. So obviously we're not going to be focusing on the specific people so much as we're going to be focusing on the businesses that are hiring those people. And the sizes of investments in technologies like AI and EV are fairly considerable, right? So depending on how you want to measure them, we've identified hundreds of principal investigators at just at Ohio State that are leading teams in AI. And they have, many graduate students and postdocs and staff. So, obviously we're not going to be disclosing data on small cells, focusing on the types of businesses and describing those businesses in a way that will not reveal individual information.
We've got a spillover question here. Lance Foss has raised, well, 750K is great for the one person, but the dollar are not spread to other workers, and there needs to be a breadth and a volume measure. And so I think that's kind of the industry of ideas and the spillover notion, right? So can you address Lance's question? Then we've got some other good ones too. Yeah.
Right. No, yeah, and I'm happy to try to answer some questions after we move on in the chat. But I think that's actually really, Lance, a really critical point is that yes, we'd love to capture and we'll be able to capture the person who makes $750,000. By the way, I want to know who's hiring this person. But the second thing is what the key part here isn't just looking at that person. It's looking at the businesses that hire that person and how they're impacted, and then the other workers at those businesses. So we're less. Obviously we're all interested in the person who's making $750,000 plus stock options, but the critical.
I want to know if he's married and if he wants to be.
Yeah, exactly.
But notice we went immediately to he. It could have been a she.
That's true. But the key is really to see is to use those people as tracers, to use those people as ways of identifying the businesses that are using AI and EV technologies, rather than to focus on those exceptional individuals themselves. Because look, we're all we're all thrilled at that kind of job prospects and job opportunities. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what the public, I think, is most interested in is how are these people affecting the economy? How are they affecting businesses, the local economies, and so forth? And that's really the key part. We're using those people as ways of tracing these technologies. And I think it goes back to this point about, AI in banking and insurance and medicine and not just in software, right? It's easy to say, oh, let's look at people who work for, Microsoft or tech companies. But the key is let's look at people who don't work for Microsoft and the tech companies, but at businesses that are using these technologies and try to see, the types of outcomes that Harry was talking about.
Well, and Lance came in and made kind of a multiplier effect comment, which is that they're spending it and it has a big impact. Adam is making a really important point: AI in development and AI in deployment. So to some extent, it's not that person is getting paid 750K because the firm believes that the ideas that they're having can get transmitted to other people in the firm and make the firm more productive. So that goes through the notion of firm effects changing because you hire some high skilled people, and then that works its way through to higher wage people in the rest of the firm. Is that a way of characterizing it?
No, and I think that's brilliant. And I think part of it is, looking at the distribution. It's a hypothesis that it would affect sort of the high wage workers, but maybe it affects the middle of the distribution, or maybe it affects the, I mean, we don't know. I mean, these are all questions that I think we really want to be able to say, how do all of the workers who are employed at these firms, how do their outcomes shift when they're touched by these kinds of research trained individuals? Is it do they reshuffle their workforce and they get sort of the workers with the high worker effects, or do they keep the people with the same worker effects but pay them more? I mean, I think those are, and what, young people, older people, where in the distribution. I think all these are the types of questions that we really want to be able to answer.
Christine, and we're out of time, but Christine made an interesting point that maybe, Christine, you can follow up with Bruce separately on this, about governments also being firms and employers, and they can affect change through what they do as well, and maybe take a leadership role to some extent. Anyway, again, I'm so grateful to that was just a terrific set of comments. The one thing you might want to think about, the states that are listening, I believe that this team, which I have an affiliation with as well, is interested in getting a state advisory group together. So Yvette and Jess will talk about that towards the end, but that you may get some reach out from SSRC and the Ohio State University going forward. Okay, now switching gears a bit, and thanks so much, Bruce. Dr. Tambari is now going to present on education and workforce. Oh, we've got someone from Ohio who's doing the dance. What is it? OHIO dance. Yes. Thank you very much. Angie, take it away from the great state of Kentucky.
All right, so
Kevin Bainbridge raised a hand. I guess it must be. So Kevin, if you could put your comment in the chat, I can read it. We can't have you speak apparently because it's a webinar. So Angie, go ahead.
All right, so I am talking about quality employment. And as people mentioned when Harry was talking, there's a reason I'm picking quality employment when I'm talking about this. And it's a very particular use case, which many of you all are familiar from coming from the class, which is that we are thinking about a multi-state post-secondary outcomes approach. So basically now for something completely different. My bias is that I am not an economist. I am educational psychologist with a psychology background. And so a lot of the questions in the chat in the beginning that we're talking about what is a good job and had these pieces, that's where I kind of started from, is this idea that a good job is about the relationship between an individual and an employer and whether the individual perceives this to be a good job. And that can have to do with a lot of trade-offs that somebody makes on a personal basis, whether it's for better healthcare, the pensions, the retirement contributions, the wages that they're earning, or other factors. And because of that, I immediately said, I can't declare a good job. So instead, I'm going to reframe the question. And what I wanted to think about was, well, what are you expecting to get from a job? And for most of us, we expect that we're getting enough money to survive, meaning we can cover food, shelter, transportation, utilities, et cetera. And so even if we don't have enough information in UI wages to figure out what I would term a good job, we may be able to determine what employment would not be or would be very unlikely to meet the criteria of a good job. So this sort of minimally necessary criteria for quality employment. And this goes into, well, why do we care about quality employment? And we have to think about the use case. So anytime we're doing something, how we're defining it and thinking about it is based on what we're doing. And we've talked about a lot of research and very specific questions earlier. This one, we're answering a question which is about the employment and earnings outcomes for post-secondary students. We're answering it for an audience. Our audience is going to be students that are picking their future degree and major. It could also be post-secondary institutions that are interested in the outcomes of their students, or even businesses that are trying to find individuals to employ. And they might be interested in what's the going wage for this sort of individual. And then a very key piece here is that the way that we're presenting this is a dashboard. And that's going to come into play in terms of how we think about this for this particular case. But we have a question that I think Julia has presented many times to people about: if I earn $5 in UI covered wages within a year, am I employed? What if that's 1,000? And we ask this not because we think $5 is quality employment, but because it helps us understand that there is some bar there where we would say, even if I wouldn't necessarily call myself employed, I know definitively if my best friend is dating someone, I ask if he's employed, and she says he earned $5 last year, I'd probably say the answer is no. So we want to think about, when someone's looking at the dashboard, what are they going to think employment encompasses? Would they think we're including the person that earned $5 in there? And specifically, if this is an audience thinking about their outcomes, are they going to think that is what we're including in here for an employment rate? And the importance of that, of course, is that we're changing our story. The instant we start cutting off these bottom patterns, they're actually valid patterns, but these patterns may not be what we would think of as employment, and we're going to have to be transparent about that. So anytime we're working cross-state, the key piece, as you've heard with these others that are, is going to be, what can we get in every state? And there, in some states, everyone has UI wage records. Everyone has QCW. It can be more difficult to access QCW at times. So we focused on unemployment insurance records, and we've covered some of, what's included and what isn't, and the fact that even when you have these data elements, not all of them are going to, your firms will vary. And each state is able to make slight adjustments to that. So even across states, because it's a joint federal state partnership program, it's going to differ a little bit, and we have some notable gaps. But across all of them, what we do have is the wages earned. You can figure out your employment firms. We can figure out the industry, which might be assigned differently, and quarters of employment. And for our purposes, I was focused on these wages, firms, and quarters of employment metrics. It would be wonderful if hours worked, weeks worked, occupation, just not present everywhere. So this is just a smattering of things, because if we're trying to put something on a dashboard, optimally, we're going to find something that is already used somewhere, because we know that some things need to be true and some things are optimally true. And one of which is that it has to be easily comprehensible, because you don't have a lot of space to explain it, and you can't expect that everybody is going to read the technical notes. So all of these are leveraged in different places and could reasonably be put across. Another piece is that the data needs to be available across states. So everything in here is using only wages and quarters worked. There's a whole additional component we could add with employers and whether you should be able to meet these thresholds with just one job, but that is a little beyond the scope of 10 minutes. And our final piece is going that this really needs to make sense to us in terms of quality employment. It needs to feel right, or be, to some extent, have some face validity in terms of, yeah, I'd say that's quality employment, at least a minimum threshold for it. So across this, we have different color coding, and that's really grouping it into these kind of buckets of where we landed. When I looked at these, there were clusters of the wages that we're expecting, and our absolute minimum is what we implemented in the multi-state post-secondary report right now, and what we use on our post-secondary feedback report, because we knew $5 wasn't enough. And so we came up with the term qualifying employment. And that is based on something that you would need to potentially qualify for a UI claim in the state of Kentucky during the 2019 calendar year. And that's at least $3,000 earned over a 4-term period and 2 quarters worked. But the post-secondary employment outcomes, they use full-time equivalent wages. And for them, they say that's 35 hours per week, 50 weeks a year, at the prevailing federal minimum wage. So calculate it out. We have close to $13,000. They also imposed a three-quarter minimum of employment. And for them, they're thinking of it in terms of some labor market perspective, and that they wanted to have people who were attached to the workforce reasonably so. And then you get some other thresholds that we're going to say anything below those first two that we're talking about, they're going to take into account family size. And so we're going to make the assumption of a unit of 1 because we don't have a household. And so we know at the minimum, you probably need to support yourself. And then on the very bottom, our pattern bars are going to have a geographic component, which brings in the idea that what I need to survive in Kentucky is not the same amount that I would need if I decided to move to a metropolitan area in California or Austin, Texas, or New York, New York. And so we also have meanings for these qualified employment. That's really just cutting off that bottom bit. Your full-time equivalent wage and federal poverty line, there you're starting to think about things that are administrative used to qualify for benefits. So you're still probably scrapping. And in Lexington, you could get a place for like $800 a month, maybe. It'd be small. And if you do that for 12 months in a year, 10,000 of your dollars are gone right away for housing. So when you get to your final three pieces here, you're starting to take into account the fact that we assume you also need to eat, you also need to pay utilities, you may need transportation, clothing, healthcare, et cetera. And so then you have that cluster of thinking about it. But anytime we start raising the threshold, the key tension here is that there are stories that are happening in the bottom, and there are people that are piecing together a lot of employment and still not making enough. So we're dropping off people every time we toss this on, and thinking about how to contextualize that is something that we're heavily debating. But we can start to have this idea of how many people we're losing when we think about just the dashboard that's out there. We have any employment and qualified employment. And qualified employment is a super low bar, 2 quarters, $3,000. And when we look at that, just in this dashboard, we can see that we lose 7,000 female completers and 4,000 male completers between these two. And what that translates to is about a 4 percentage point drop in terms of the employment rate that you might expect. But also, you're going to see differences in the wages. So it ends up being about it affects, of course, the 25th percentile more. We're using percentiles because we want to kind of handle the outliers. But the key piece is that the 25th percentile is getting dragged down by about $3,000 by these earlier patterns that are happening. And then once you get to the 75th percentile, it's being dragged down by about $1,000. So it does affect both the employment rate and the wage as expected. And it is something we have to consider as we're sharing the story in terms of how do we explain what percentage we're not picking up in terms of this employment. And that keeps me under 10 minutes.
Well done, Angie. Thank you so much. And that was a tour de force of all the information that can be done with these kinds of data. And I just want to reinforce, and I think you said that this earlier, Angie, but the investment, this cross-state dashboard, it is true that it was precipitated by an Ohio State class that was jointly run with Kentucky. But it's also important to note that the investments in the state longitudinal data system by the Department of Education and to some extent by the Department of Labor, the Workforce Innovation Grants, is the reason that you were able to get some of this work done. So you have told me that a million times, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. Some very good comments in the chat. Adam has a comment on determining they have used a measure of average Texas family as a way to come up with a self-sufficient annual income level that is based on the weighted average family mix. That's a very thoughtful approach, right? So have you, I don't think Texas is part of this project yet, but it will be, I hope. But what was your reaction to that comment?
The average Texas family?
Yeah.
That one? So we've actually used that, and I almost mentioned it, not the average Texas family, of course, because we're Kentucky, at least what I'm thinking from our perspective. But we have used that when we've been looking at things like a benefit cliff, and we've tried to assess everything based on both if you only have to support yourself, and also what are the most common family types that exist, so that it's very easy to search and figure out at what point you would have a benefit cliff, which is how we've used those two together. And that is something that actually Jason and I had discussed, and was just what is the assumption of a single person household the correct assumption? So it's something that's going to get noted, because basically all of this is going to get wrapped into, we're working on a paper that can be out there, not for any glory, but so that everybody can contribute and continue to delve into this discussion as to when these are useful measures. And so we will add that in. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Adam.
great comment, Adam. And I should point you also to the technical notes on the, maybe Angie, you could put the link to the multi-state post-secondary report in the chat, as well as the technical notes. Yeah, Lance, absolutely, the insightful research, and this has been a project for the past several years, 4 or 5 years at least, and watching it spread across the states is really been a joy, because to some extent this dashboard can be used to look at cross-state flows and instantiate the vision that Bruce talked about. Bruce's project is another project that's just started, but you could imagine building on the multi-state dashboard. So the Yvette has a comment on the EITC. Have you looked at the extent to which the EITC and SNAP help fill the gap for jobs and firms that don't on their own provide quality employment?
That is an amazing question.
That's from Yvette, so I'm not surprised.
I personally haven't. I wouldn't be surprised if someone in my office has, and I have not noticed that. But that is something I will follow up on.
And Lance has a related comment about UI claims. So those UI claims are available as well, and they're able to be linked in quite not easily, but readily, I think is the right word. And by the way, with the claims, you also get demographics and language and residents and so on. So that's another addition that could be put in later, because you could get a very long way on the wage records and the just by themselves in the education information.
One of the things I'd like to say is that if anybody has a way you've been using it in your state, please email me. This is my example. This is how I've used it. This is why we've chosen, because I would love to know.
And I would very much hope to see these birds of a feather continue, so that people can share different ideas and different approaches, because it takes a village. It shouldn't just be one person doing a lot of the work. Any other comments from the floor? Because then I'll flip it over to Dana. And so, sorry, Dr. Brandt, since I'm being formal at this point. Dr. Brandt from Rhode Island, the great state of Rhode Island. So if you could share your screen and take it away. Thank you. And
sure.
Again, here's the longitudinal data systems again. So it's the education workforce data that's giving this powerhouse.
Actually, I'm going to build right off of Angie's comment, or her call for more information on how other states are using it. All of this work that's happening in states is really being supercharged by these multi-state data collaboratives. The multi-state data collaboratives are building on the investments from the federal grant programs that Julia mentioned, and in some very lucky states, the state investment in these state longitudinal data systems. And they're allowing us to develop a professional network across state lines, where we can take successful projects like the work that most of our SLDSs are already doing to measure outcomes of education and training programs and build them into robust products like the multi-state post-secondary report. And from there, build shared practices, methodological approaches, and code even. So Adam's suggestion to start to use census data is a perfect example. And Yvette's comment about looking at the EITC and SNAP benefits are all great ways that the states are coming together to help each other improve all of the work that we're already doing. So a lot of this work is built around this SLDS or P20W framework that has existed for quite a while now in these states where we're used to following participants from, early education in some places through post-secondary and workforce training programs, and then into the workforce. It's a familiar model for a lot of states, but by coming together through the class and on projects like the multi-state post-secondary report, we're able to have a safe sandbox where we can experiment with the synthetic data that Kentucky provided, where we can experiment with ideas together and apply some of these things that are happening in our states and test out different approaches. So using this framework that most of our states are already familiar with, we often look at measures related to employment and wages, and in some cases equity, to start to identify what can be a quality job. These are the questions we'll often ask ourselves, when we're measuring a program, but we can apply them in some ways to measure workforce and job quality as well. Knowing whether someone, first of all, is employed after a program, and are they retaining that employment? How many quarters are they employed? As Angie mentioned, having a threshold there. Or how many jobs do they hold for those states that don't have high quality data on hours and weeks worked? Sometimes looking at the number of jobs gives us an approximation. We're often looking at wages, and not just using medians, but using different quartiles, and then benchmarking that against living wages for our area. If we're very lucky and we get to take a more longitudinal analysis of things, because we have that data and we're not just reporting the immediate outcomes, we can look at wage trajectories. And then as a couple of the comments mentioned, we can start to break down these outcomes by different demographics. And because our systems already have that demographic data, whether it's from the educational records themselves, workforce training records, which sometimes have more high quality demographics, or other sources that our states are sharing, we can understand if women and racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented in these good jobs, or if they're experiencing the same wage growth patterns that we're seeing generally across the board. And again, all the code for this in our states is often available. We've been doing this for years. We have projects that we can return to the code, recycle it, and now we have contacts in other states, so we can use that code. And if you don't know someone in your state who's doing this work, please reach out. The folks in SLDSs or in your friendly labor market shop probably want to help you. This is the kind of stuff that we get really excited about doing. So again, we're used to looking at participants in a program. Have they completed that program? In Rhode Island, the healthcare workforce is always top of mind. So we often have projects that dig into completers from healthcare programs at the post-secondary level. Are they then entering Rhode Island's workforce at all? If they are, is it in the healthcare sector? And then from there, we might look to see, are they retaining that employment a year later? Or are they exiting healthcare, particularly in the wake of COVID and the high demand that they were experiencing in their role, the pressures on them? Or are people who studied in a healthcare program maybe not starting there, but eventually transitioning? So this is a normal flow, but some of the work that the early presenters shared, we can start to think about taking this normal framework and flipping it backwards. So once we've identified and benchmarked what good jobs look like, because we've studied these new hires who come straight from a training program or a degree program, we can expand and say, are those still good jobs for experienced workers, other people in those firms? We can expand the research further and start to say, well, what about other industries? Particularly like this NSF project, where we start to think about work like with data science and AI that crosses our traditional NAICS code industries. You might find those people who've studied in those fields working in an SLDS, so they're in state government, or maybe they're in healthcare, or they might be in manufacturing. And so if we can pinpoint good jobs because we have a benchmark from familiar work, we can turn it on its head and start to look at good jobs writ large. And we can go even further back and trace the credentials that folks might need in order to be employed in these good jobs. I'm always a fast talker, so I think I've saved us probably at least 3 minutes.
You did a great job. Thank you so much, Dana. So you've got very nice comments on the visual, and so it was a very, very proactive and helpful comment. A couple of questions that I'm sure, reminder to everyone to put questions in the chat. I had actually not put a lot of time for discussion for you. I just realized that when I looked at the agenda. The comments on the earnings distribution, I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I talk about the synthesis to the class. One thing that both Angie and you highlighted was the importance of job duration, the number of quarters that people are working, and so on. So do you want to say a few words about that? Because at the beginning, in the response to Harry's comments, there was a thing talking about wage effects, but wages and employment are two different things, and that people were talking about how long are you working, how many weeks worked, or how many quarters in a year. Do you want to talk a little bit about wage records being able to unpack both wages and number of quarters? And then we've got a couple more comments, but if you could just kind of unpack a little bit about how you deal with those particular questions, the price and the quantity issues.
Sure. So bare minimum, most state records are going to get you the quarterly wages earned. So you know that someone is employed in the quarter and earned these wages. In some states, you might be very lucky to get hours and weeks worked in that quarter to better understand how long, the duration of employment within a quarter and the wages earned. But often you don't have all of that at your fingertips. And so you're going to be making some guesses. And so using things like the number of quarters in the year or the number of jobs in the year will help the SLDS teams approximate.
Yeah, so in other words, I think that was the perfect answer, because what you're doing there is you're really explaining how creative use of the wage records can give you a lot more information about how many jobs and how long employment lasts with a particular employer. There's a comment here from Ronnie Kinoshita. This might have been covered earlier in the webinar. Our access to these job quality data sets state by state, are they compiled at the federal level? That's a great question, because of course the ideal here would be to have it. They are available state by state, and they could be linked across states and across agencies in principle. What would it take to get there, do you think, Dana?
I think this multi-state post-secondary dashboard is a great example of laying the groundwork to get there. Where the states are deciding to opt in themselves. So it's not directed by the federal government, it's the state saying, we can see value in linking our data together. Those are the two primary options there. The states decide, or there's some direction from the federal government. But as the states decide, we hit the challenges that Angie mentioned. Our records look different across state lines. We might not be collecting the same variables. And so we have to get creative and find the common denominator.
I think to some extent what you're saying is a bottom-up approach. Louis Brandeis had this great quote that states are the laboratories of democracy. And so the advantage of states trying different things is some things are not going to work, some things are going to work, and you can ride the horses that do work. Adam Lemon talks about leveraging SLDSs. So both the wage records, the UI wage records, and linking data across state lines takes federal funding, but state bottom-up innovation. So that was fantastic discussion. I'm going to actually illustrate some of the work that's been done in the states in the class, so which is going to complement what you just said. And I'd like to come back to you, if you could, right afterwards and get you to comment. So as you know, what we did was we ran the class, and the state of Kentucky provided synthetic data so that we could learn how to do these things. And the state spent, there were 8 teams, 7 of those were states, and you can see the states who were represented in the class. These are related to the college initiative classes, where I think almost every state in the country has sent people. But I'm going to focus right here on synthesizing the job quality measures that the different teams used. So with very practical applications. So here we have a bunch of smart people from both education and workforce, and they were let loose on the linked education workforce data, and they said, let's take a look at some questions that are of interest to you. I'm cutting and pasting from some of these presentations. Their papers are available from the teams. The presentations are also available on the class website. But here's an example. Job quality, we think of it as being an absolute. But one of the things that a couple of the teams zeroed in on is if you're trying to figure out whether people are going to stay in a field in which they're trained, relativity is important. So it's not just an absolute measure of job quality, it's relative to what they could be making somewhere else, which, Angie, that's what economists think about all the time, right? Opportunity cost. So what they looked at was, in computer science, why are people leaking out? Is it their wages relative to completing versus non-completing? So if the value of completing is only marginally greater than not completing, people are probably going to make a decision not to complete. So there was a lot of interesting stuff there, particularly looking at genders differences. And while that particular picture on the left from team 2 focused in on a particular snapshot, year 7, another team said, well, why do we have shortages of teachers? And they looked not just at their beginning earnings, but also their earnings over time. So job quality has a time dimension as well as a relativity dimension. So you can start to see how these state agencies are coming up with more descriptive and maybe more analytical approaches to thinking about describing job quality. Remember, they can take that that information and reuse the code and do the analyses, rinse and repeat in their own states because of the similarity of the structure of the data sets. Here's another team. And, what Angie was describing very much was, and Dana was very much, we can use wage records to describe the entire distribution of earnings. So I cited the example of $750,000 for a computer science graduate. Is that kind of the top of the distribution, or is it the bottom of the distribution? Is it the mean? What's the spread look like? And so team 6 looked at the spread in a particular year and then over time. So means and medians tell you one thing, but you could look at the distribution. And I think Ross highlighted that earlier. What metric of job quality are you looking at? And the other thing to look at, another team, team 7, it costs time to get a degree. So when we're looking at the educational outcomes, the earnings outcomes of particular education investments, you want to look at it not just in terms of job quality at a particular time point, but job quality relative to the amount of time you had to invest to get to a particular major and a particular degree. And they had a very innovative approach because they don't just look at the averages, but they said, how many relative to the median? And how long do you have to take to get an earnings relative to a particular median. The creativity that these teams showed, going back to what question are you trying to answer? I think Dr. Weinberg talked about, Bruce talked about that. What question are you trying to answer, and how can you convey that in a useful way to the population? I love this approach that Team 8 looked at, not just earnings. How many quarters were you employed? Do you have stable employment? So looking at the quantity of jobs, which Dana just talked about. Another point, and the Team 4, this was their killer presentation. I'm just showing one of them. The complexity of pathways that people can take. So we're so used to saying, oh, well, they studied and then they got this earnings. And that's what the multi-states dashboard does very nicely. But what Team 4 looked at, and I know that's a very busy slide, but it is so packed with the different pathways that people can take. And in essence, looking at the choices that they make on each one of those different pathways. Team 5 took a different take, and they looked at, well, how much education in computer science do I need to succeed? And not just over time, but you could see that what's happening is a lot of them are leaving the state. So what's happening? Maybe they decide that the way to success is to leave the great state of Kentucky and go maybe to the great state of Ohio. But those simply looking at one state, clearly you need these cross-state pictures to understand, are they leaving for better jobs elsewhere? I wanted to answer some questions now. I hope you're as excited about these work that the states have been doing, and I'm going to answer the questions in the chat in just a minute. I do want to point out that this webinar and this Birds of a Feather session, we are very much hoping that it turns into much more, which is why Dana was talking about the multi-state data collaboratives. We're going to hand this over to Yvette and Jess in just a minute. Other states are doing these data literacy classes, Kentucky and Ohio in particular. I believe Arkansas is as well. We're expecting to be putting out a book, and the notebooks are going to be made available, we hope, on this real-world data science platform, or potentially also by the publishers. And we're very much hoping that the state agencies will share their data and their notebooks, not their data, their notebooks as a collaborative activity. So let me stop there so that I hope you've got a really excited sense of what can be done. So the BLS wage record program is certainly one approach, as Ross has pointed out. And so multiple ways to share data wage records. And then you can, Adam has pointed out this as well. So the sharing of data, I think, is at the very core of that. So I'm conscious of the time. So Ross has put some comments in about the BLS wage record program. Obviously, the College Initiative has the administrative data research facility, and the training programs are very much a way of building the capacity to work with cross-state data. Okay, so Yvette, this is a very nice segue for you to talk about what NASWA is doing, and then Jessica to talk about what Colleges has been doing.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to go off camera, but wanted to say hi on camera first. I have somebody here helping to support us at the house, so just want to make sure that we're not disturbed. So I don't know if any of you saw the article in a major news magazine last week about a public health crisis, an alarming rise in auto fatality rates during the pandemic, and how a few committed individuals, birds of a feather, began collecting and using local data to highlight and address the issues. It really drew to mind what you all are doing here exemplifying that same spirit, but wanting to go beyond the data gaps and create new understandings that can have an impact. So when Julia reached out, it was clear that I and Jessica should come and make sure you're invited into the Multi-State Data Collaborative if you're not aware of it. The collaborative is governed by state agency leaders and focuses on a range of education and workforce and human development topics that are priorities for state agencies. And like Julia said, there is an infrastructure supported by 2 service organizations and a growing number of technical and data partners. We're a cross-sector, cross-functional network that builds on existing longitudinal data infrastructure. And importantly, existing relationships within and across your treasured state membership association, especially SHEO, higher education, NASWA, workforce, but also increasingly, if informally at this point, APHSA, human services, and CCSSO schools. So a priority area of focus at our upcoming 3rd annual meeting. Yeah,
Yvette, there's a question in the chat. Are you going to be showing slides?
no, I'm not showing
okay.
slides.
Okay, thanks.
A priority area of focus at our upcoming, it's going to be the 3rd annual meeting in March in DC. Sorry, my voice is a little off. Will be job quality measures. You'll have a chance first to learn about a broader range of data projects and products that are emerging. But we're going to then break out into what we hope will be ongoing project groups focused on specific topics, including job quality. So we hope presenters and state agencies and partners here today will come in March and help learn about and translate the innovations and projects on today's agenda and kind of continue the path to build and scale some good things together, and do so with more quality and efficiency than if any state leader was operating on their own. And I want to point out that in the collaborative, we try to meet states where they are. There are no membership fees, and whereas in one state the value might rest in leveraging an existing practice or tool, there are those, like some or all of you, that are more intent on developing new data practices and products that working with other states and agencies. So I'll provide some information in the chat, including a list of the ways that states find value in the network, as well as our website where you can reach out via email and contact me for more information. But I'll turn now to Jessica, who's my close partner at the Coleridge Initiative, which, as Julia just mentioned, is a key service organization for the collaborative, and Jessica can explain their role and provide more details on the upcoming 3-day March events, which include the 1-day collaborative annual meeting and then a broader 2-day Coleridge national convening.
Thank you, Yvette. And it says the host has turned off my video, so I can't turn on my video. If somebody could turn that on, that'd be great.
So Rachel, Jody, can you turn the video on?
Perfect.
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Yvette. So I'll stick with the formality, and as Dr. Lane mentioned, at the Coleridge Initiative, we have the Administrative Data Research Facility, which serves as the platform organization supporting the multi-state data collaboratives. And so really what I'm here to talk about is kind of the next steps in taking the great momentum that you've seen Dr. Lane and all of the speakers here today talk about, and how are we going to move this conversation forward. And so in the chat, I set a link to the registration for our upcoming March convening. And so it's a 3-day event. The first day is the state day, in which you'll get to see presentations of projects and products, kind of like what you saw today, but beyond that. And then also there'll be a topical working group around this particular topic in the afternoon on Monday. And then when we expand to the larger audience on Tuesday, we will add partners from federal agencies, other research organizations that might not be connected to state teams, and then also philanthropic organizations to expand the conversation. And on Tuesday afternoon, we'll have domain-specific breakouts where job quality measures are going to be a part of those breakout sessions. And then when we come back to the larger group, there'll be a panel discussion how state agencies and research institutions, like what Bruce was talking about earlier today, are kind of linking arms and trying to move and innovate the work forward in this space. So we hope that you will join us in March to really, move this work forward. And then following the March convening, as Dr. Lane alluded to, there'll be opportunities for upcoming state advisory board committees that will guide the work that is going on with Bruce and team. And then finally, as Yvette alluded to, topical working groups as a part of the multi-state data collaboratives in which they can continue the idea sharing that Dana mentioned as well. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much. So Yvette, Marty is asking for information on how to register for the State Collaborative Day. I think.
Yeah, I'll put an email address, Julia, in the chat, as well as a
Okay.
link to the website.
That would be fantastic. Oh, great. So now that's just shown up in the chat. So this has been a fantastic meeting. I'm so grateful to everyone for showing up. We had tremendous attendance. Does anyone have any closing comments? We had booked 2 hours, but I think we're being very efficient with our team, with our time. So, okay, well, with no further ado, we'll reach out, we'll send you the slides, and we'll also send you the recordings. And I want to thank the University of Maryland for supporting this. They've been such great partners all the way through. And honestly, the teams in the training class were just, I'm gobsmacked by the quality of the work that's been done. So, and their team leads. So thanks to everyone, and you'll hear from University of Maryland and NASWA and the College Initiative, and thanks for coming.